My golden brother stole my boyfriend, and when I ruined his reputation, he got fired from his job and my boyfriend. Growing up, it always felt like my family had a favorite. My younger brother Jake, now 24, has been the golden child for as long as I can remember. He's handsome, charming, and excels at everything he touches. Meanwhile, I'm Grace, 27 years old, and perpetually stuck in the shadow of my brother's glowing reputation. It wasn't always this bad. When we were little, I idolized Jake. He was funny and confident, and people naturally gravitated toward him. But as we grew older, I started to notice how different things were for the two of us. If Jake came home with an A on a test, my parents celebrated like he'd cured cancer. But if I got an A, their response was more like, "That's what we expect from you, Grace." There was no party, no celebration, just a quiet, obligatory good job. But the real crack in our sibling dynamic happened when Mike entered the picture. Mike was the new guy in town during my junior year of college. We met through mutual friends at a house party, and I was instantly drawn to him. He had this easy smile, messy blonde hair, and a laugh that could light up a room. We ended up talking all night about music, travel, and everything in between. I was smitten. I didn't confess my feelings right away. I wanted to take my time, get to know him better, and maybe build up the courage to tell him how I felt. Mike became a regular part of our friend group, and I loved every moment we spent together, even if it was just in a group setting. It felt like we had something special, even though we never crossed that line into something romantic. Then Jake started showing up. Jake didn't know Mike at first. In fact, he didn't even like hanging out with my friends. But one day, I brought Mike home to help me move some heavy furniture, and that's when the shift happened. Jake charmed Mike in less than 5 minutes. They bonded over football, video games, and a shared love of hiking. Before I knew it, they were texting each other, making plans to hang out without me. At first, I tried to be happy about it. Mike was important to me, so I figured it was a good thing that he and Jake got along. But then, the insecurities started creeping in. Every time I saw the two of them together, laughing and joking like they'd known each other for years, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Jake was stealing another part of my life, and I was powerless to stop it. The moment that truly broke me happened on a random Saturday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I overheard Jake and Mike talking in the kitchen. Jake was telling some story about a hiking trip he took last summer, and Mike was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Man, you're hilarious," Mike said between chuckles. "We should plan a trip together sometime. Just the two of us." Jake grinned. "Yeah, definitely. Grace, you wouldn't mind, right?" I froze. Jake had to know how I felt about Mike. I hadn't outright told him, but I wasn't exactly subtle about it either. My heart was practically written all over my face every time Mike was around. And yet, there he was, casually planning a trip with Mike like my feelings didn't even exist. Later that night, I tried to confront Jake about it. I waited until we were alone in his room and then blurted it out. "Why are you always trying to take things from me?" Jake looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "Mike," I said, "you're trying to steal him from me." Jake laughed, which only made me angrier. "Steal him? Grace, he's not yours to steal. He's my friend too. He was my friend first," I snapped. "You didn't even know him until I introduced you." Jake rolled his eyes. "Look, if you're so worried about it, why don't you just tell him how you feel?" "Oh, wait. You're too scared to do that, aren't you?" His words hit me like a slap in the face. I wanted to scream, to yell at him for being so callous, but instead, I just walked out of the room. I didn't have the energy to fight him anymore. The next few weeks were torture. Jake and Mike were practically inseparable. They went hiking, played basketball, and even started working on a joint project for some local charity event. Meanwhile, I was stuck on the sidelines, watching as Jake continued to overshadow me in every possible way. One day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I invited Mike out for coffee, determined to finally tell him how I felt. But when I got to the cafe, I saw him sitting at a table with Jake. They were laughing, as usual, completely oblivious to the fact that my heart was breaking. I turned around and walked out without saying a word. It wasn't long after that when I overheard Jake talking to my mom. He was bragging about how he and Mike were planning a cross-country road trip. "It's going to be epic," he said. "Just the two of us, hitting all the national parks." "I can't wait." My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe Jake would do this to me again. It wasn't enough that he'd stolen my parents' attention, my achievements, and my friends. Now, he was taking Mike too. I felt a surge of anger like I'd never felt before. For once, I wasn't going to let Jake win. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I was done being this second-best child. It was time to take my life back, even if it meant burning a few bridges along the way. If Jake's closeness with Mike wasn't hard enough to bear, the way he flaunted it in front of me felt like pure cruelty. Every time they were together, it was like Jake went out of his way to make sure I knew exactly how close they'd become. Whether it was an inside joke, a shared look, or Jake casually throwing his arm around Mike's shoulders, it all felt deliberate, like he wanted to remind me that I was on the outside looking in. One evening, we were all sitting in the living room. My parents, Jake, Mike, and me. Jake was recounting some story about how he and Mike had crushed their competition at a recent trivia night. He was animated, his grin wide as he threw in little jabs about how Mike was the brains and he was the charm. "You guys should have seen it," Jake said, looking directly at me. "Mike was unstoppable. Honestly, Grace, you should hang out with us more. You might learn a thing or two." Mike laughed awkwardly, clearly sensing the tension in the room. But my parents, of course, ate it up. My mom chuckled and said, "Well, that's Jake for you. Always finding the best people to surround himself with." Her comment felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't enough that Jake had stolen Mike's attention. Now he had my parents' full support, too. They didn't even seem to notice how uncomfortable I was. A few days later, I found myself alone with Mike. It was a rare moment where Jake wasn't around, and I decided to take the opportunity to finally ask him something that had been gnawing at me. "Mike," I started, my voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, smiling that easy smile of his. Why did you and Jake get so close? I mean, I'm the one who introduced you, but it feels like you two just clicked." Mike looked a little taken aback by the question. "I don't know. I guess we just have a lot in common. He's a cool guy." I nodded, trying to hide how much his words stung. "Did you ever, I don't know, think about us? I mean, before you and Jake started hanging out?" Mike hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like regret flash across his face. "Honestly? Yeah, I did. But I wasn't sure if you felt the same way. And, well, your parents kind of gave me the impression that you weren't interested." My heart sank. "My parents? What do you mean?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Your mom said something about how you were focused on your career and didn't have time for relationships. She kind of steered me toward Jake. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My own parents, my own flesh and blood, had sabotaged me. They'd taken the one person I cared about and handed him over to Jake, as if I didn't matter. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Jake being the favorite. This was my parents actively working against me. That night, I confronted them. "Why would you tell Mike I wasn't interested in him?" I demanded, storming into the kitchen where my mom was preparing dinner and my dad was reading the newspaper. My mom looked up, startled. "Grace, what are you talking about?" "Mike," I said through gritted teeth. "He told me that you told him I wasn't interested in a relationship. Why would you do that?" My mom's expression shifted to something defensive. "Grace, we were just looking out for you. You've always been so focused on your career. We didn't think you'd want to be distracted." "Distracted?" I spat. "You had no right to make that decision for me. And then to push him toward Jake? What the hell is wrong with you?" "Don't raise your voice at your mother," my dad said, finally looking up from his paper. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said sarcastically. Wouldn't want to upset the parents who seemed to care more about Jake's happiness than mine. My mom sighed. "Grace, this isn't about favoritism. Jake just has a way of connecting with people. It's not our fault if he and Mike hit it off." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were defending him, again. No matter what Jake did, he could do no wrong in their eyes. I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Things only got worse after that. Jake started ramping up his affection for Mike in front of me, as if he knew exactly what buttons to press. He'd casually drape an arm around Mike's shoulders or lean in close when they were talking, always glancing in my direction to make sure I noticed. One night, we were all watching a movie together. Jake and Mike were sharing the couch, while I was relegated to an armchair on the other side of the room. At one point, Jake leaned over and whispered something in Mike's ear, and they both burst out laughing. I felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation rise in my chest. "What's so funny?" I snapped, unable to keep quiet any longer. Jake smirked. "Nothing you'd understand." It was the final straw. I couldn't sit there and watch them anymore. I got up and left the room, ignoring their questioning looks. Later that night, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, tears streaming down my face. I felt like I was losing everything. Mike, my parents, even my own sense of self. Jake had taken it all, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. But then, an idea started to form in my mind. If Jake was going to keep taking from me, maybe it was time for me to take something back. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I was done playing the victim. It was time to level the playing field, even if it meant confronting Jake head-on. This wasn't just about Mike anymore. This was about reclaiming my place in my own life, and I wasn't going to let Jake or anyone else stand in my way. The day I decided I wasn't going to let Jake walk all over me anymore felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in weeks. My anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface for years, finally found a purpose. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him steal my life. I was going to fight back. And the first step was getting Mike back on my side. I started small. I knew Mike and Jake hung out regularly, so I needed a way to reconnect with Mike without Jake hovering over us. Luckily, Mike was a creature of habit. Every Saturday morning, he grabbed coffee at this little cafe downtown. I started showing up there, timing my visits so we'd accidentally run into each other. At first, it was awkward. He clearly didn't know how to act around me after everything that had happened. But I kept it light, focusing on rebuilding our friendship. "Hey, Mike," I said one morning as I approached his table. "Mind if I join you?" He looked up, surprised but not unhappy. "Sure, Grace. Of course." We talked for over an hour that day. Nothing heavy, just easy, casual conversation about work, hobbies, and mutual friends. It felt good to be around him again, to remind myself that we'd had a connection long before Jake came into the picture. By the end of our coffee, he was smiling at me like he used to, and I felt a glimmer of hope. While I worked on rebuilding my bond with Mike, I also started digging into Jake's life. If I was going to expose him for the selfish, manipulative person he really was, I needed evidence, things I could use to show Mike, and maybe even my parents, that Jake wasn't the golden boy they thought he was. The first crack in Jake's perfect facade came when I overheard him on the phone one night. I was walking past his room when I caught snippets of his conversation. Something about maxing out another card and needing more time to pay it off. My curiosity was piqued, so I waited until he left the house the next day and snuck into his room. Jake had always been careless about his belongings, and his financial papers were no exception. I found a stack of credit card statements shoved in a drawer, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the totals. He owed over $25,000 across multiple cards, with minimum payments he clearly couldn't keep up with. It was a far cry from the image he projected of someone who had it all together. Next, I turned my attention to his past relationships. Jake had always been popular with women, but his charm didn't extend far beyond the honeymoon phase. I reached out to one of his ex-girlfriends, a woman named Rachel, who I vaguely remembered from a couple of years ago. We weren't close, but I figured it was worth a shot. To my surprise, Rachel was more than willing to talk. "Jake," she said with a bitter laugh when I called her. "What about him?" I'm trying to understand him better," I said, choosing my words carefully. "We've had some issues lately, and I thought maybe you could give me some insight." Rachel didn't hold back. She told me about how Jake had been sweet and attentive in the beginning, but quickly revealed a darker side. "He's so selfish," she said. "Everything always had to be about him. And if I ever called him out on it, he'd gaslight me into thinking I was the problem." She went on to describe how he cheated on her with one of her friends, and then blamed her for being too controlling. By the time she finished, I felt like I had more than enough ammunition to take him down. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I stumbled upon Jake's group chat with his friends. I hadn't meant to snoop, I was just borrowing his laptop to print something. But the chat was open on the screen, and I couldn't resist taking a look. What I found made my blood boil. The messages were full of crude jokes and bragging about his latest exploits. He'd been stringing along a girl named Lila, who was clearly infatuated with him, while also hooking up with someone else on the side. But what really got me was the way he talked about Mike. "Grace is so hung up on him," one message read. "It's pathetic. She doesn't stand a chance." Another message said, "Mike's cool, but let's be real. He's not going to stick around when he finds out what a mess Grace is." Armed with everything I'd found, I started putting my plan into motion. The first step was to let Mike see the cracks in Jake's perfect image. I casually brought up Jake's debts during one of our coffee meetups, framing it as concern. "I'm worried about him," I said. "I found out he's in a lot of financial trouble, and I don't think he knows how to handle it." Mike looked genuinely surprised. "Jake? Really? He always seems like he has everything under control." "That's the thing," I said. "He's good at hiding it, but I don't want him to get in over his head." Next, I shared what Rachel had told me. Spinning it is something I'd learned through the grapevine. "I don't know if you've heard, but his last relationship didn't end well. Apparently, he wasn't very honest with her." Mike's expression darkened. "That's not cool." The final nail in the coffin came when I sent him screenshots from Jake's group chat. I didn't say much, just forwarded the messages and added, "Thought you should see this." Mike called me almost immediately after. "Grace, what the hell is this?" he demanded. "It's Jake," I said simply. "I thought you deserved to know the truth." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I can't believe he talk about you like that," Mike finally said. "And the stuff about Lila, it's just messed up." From that point on, things started to shift. Mike still spent time with Jake, but there was a noticeable distance between them. Meanwhile, he and I grew closer, meeting for coffee more frequently and even going on a few hikes together. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally gaining ground, but I knew this was only the beginning. Jake wasn't going to give up easily, and my parents were still firmly on his side. If I wanted to truly take back control, I'd need to keep pushing. The game wasn't over yet, and I was just getting started. When Jake and Mike announced their engagement, it felt like the final betrayal. Mike had been the one person I thought might see through Jake's manipulative charm, but instead, he'd fallen for it completely. I knew I had to act quickly. Jake couldn't keep getting away with his lies and deceit. Not this time. The first step in my plan was to subtly plant seeds of doubt in Mike's mind. I didn't want to come across as bitter or vindictive, so I kept my tone neutral whenever I brought up Jake's past. "Have you ever wondered why Jake's past relationships didn't work out?" I asked Mike casually one afternoon. We were sitting on a bench in the park, sipping iced coffee. Mike frowned. "Not really." "Why?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "I just heard some things from his ex, Rachel. She said he wasn't exactly honest with her." Mike's brows furrowed. "Honest how?" "She didn't go into details," I lied. "But it sounded like he had a habit of keeping things from her." I let the conversation drop after that, but I could tell Mike was thinking about it. His usual easy smile was absent, and he seemed distracted for the rest of our meetup. Over the next few weeks, I began spreading the word about Jake's financial troubles. It wasn't hard. Jake had burned plenty of bridges with his reckless behavior, and people were more than willing to gossip. I made sure to keep my involvement subtle, framing it as concern whenever I brought it up. "Have you heard about Jake's credit card debt?" I asked Rachel during a casual phone call. "I'm worried he's in over his head." Rachel, who still harbored resentment toward Jake, was more than happy to spread the news. Within days, the whispers started circulating. People who'd once admired Jake began to see him in a different light. One of the most shocking discoveries I made during this time was about Jake's relationship with his ex Lila. I found out from a mutual acquaintance, Erica, that Lila had left Jake after discovering he'd been cheating on her with one of her friends. Erica was more than willing to fill in the details when I reached out to her. Lila was devastated. Erica told me over the phone, she really thought Jake was the one, but he completely betrayed her. Did she ever confront him about it? I asked. "Oh, she did," Erica said with a bitter laugh, "but he just gaslit her into thinking it was her fault." Typical Jake. I made sure to casually drop this information into conversations with mutual friends, knowing it would eventually reach Mike. I didn't need to embellish the story. Jake's actions spoke for themselves. The tension between Jake and Mike became impossible to ignore. Mike started asking Jake pointed questions about his finances and past relationships, and Jake, true to form, became defensive and evasive. Their once easy camaraderie turned into awkward silences and passive-aggressive arguments. One evening, I overheard them fighting in the living room. Jake was pacing back and forth, his voice raised. "Why are you suddenly questioning everything I do? Where is this coming from?" Mike, who rarely raised his voice, sounded exasperated. "Because I feel like I don't even know who you are anymore, Jake. You never mentioned your debts, and then I hear all this stuff about Lila and Rachel. What else are you hiding?" Jake's face turned red. "Are you seriously going to believe gossip over me? You know how people love to tear me down." "I don't know what to believe," Mike shot back. "That's the problem." Their fights became more frequent after that. Jake tried to smooth things over with grand gestures, fancy dinners, expensive gifts, but it only seemed to make things worse. Mike, who'd always been grounded and practical, started seeing Jake's flashy behavior for what it was, a desperate attempt to cover up his flaws. The breaking point came during a family dinner. Jake, in a bid to win back Mike's favor, had organized a lavish meal at our parents' house. The table was set with fine china, and Jake had even hired a private chef to prepare the food. It was over the top, even for him. As we sat down to eat, my mom gushed about how thoughtful Jake was. "He's always been so generous," she said, smiling at Mike. "You're lucky to have him." Mike's expression was unreadable as he stared down at his plate. "Generous with what?" he said finally. Credit cards he can't afford to pay off? The room went silent. Jake's face turned a deep shade of red. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means I'm tired of the lies, Jake, Mike said, his voice steady. I'm tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is bullshit. You're listening to rumors and gossip instead of trusting me. I wanted to trust you, Mike said quietly. But you made that impossible. The engagement ended that night. Mike packed up his things and left without another word, leaving Jake fuming and my parents in stunned silence. I stayed out of sight, watching the scene unfold from the hallway. The next day, Jake confronted me. He barged into my room, his eyes blazing with anger. This is your fault, he spat. I don't know how you did it, but I know you're the reason Mike left. I crossed my arms, keeping my voice calm. Maybe Mike just realized you're not who he thought you were. Jake glared at me, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over, Grace. I met his gaze, unflinching. You're right, it's not over. But this time, I'm not the one who's going to lose. The fallout from Mike calling off the engagement was immediate and brutal. Jake, who had spent his entire life basking in admiration and privilege, was suddenly at the center of a whirlwind of scandal and doubt. His perfect image, the golden boy, the charmer, the untouchable, began to crumble before his eyes. It started with his job. Jake had always prided himself on being the top salesperson at a prestigious tech company, where his charm and charisma helped him close deals effortlessly. But charm can only get you so far when people start questioning your integrity. Word about his financial troubles and personal drama spread quickly, thanks in part to the tight-knit industry Jake worked in. Clients began pulling back, wary of working with someone who couldn't even manage his own finances. One day, I overheard Jake on the phone with his boss, Greg, a no-nonsense type who valued professionalism above all else. Jake, this isn't about the rumors, Greg said, his voice cold and detached. Your performance has been slipping for months. And frankly, we can't afford to have someone with your reputation representing the company. Jake tried to argue, but it was no use. He was fired on the spot. When he came home that evening, his usually confident demeanor was replaced by a heavy silence. He went straight to his room and slammed the door, leaving my parents to exchange worried glances. Losing his job was just the beginning. Jake's friends, most of whom were more like followers, drawn to his magnetic personality and flashy lifestyle, began distancing themselves from him. I overheard snippets of conversations, like his former best friend Ryan saying, "Jake's a sinking ship, man. I don't want to get dragged down with him." Even Mike, who had once been Jake's closest ally, cut off all contact. He moved on quickly, diving into his work and rekindling old friendships that didn't involve my brother. I heard through the grapevine that Mike had started seeing someone new, a kind, down-to-earth woman named Claire who worked at a nearby nonprofit. It stung a little, knowing I hadn't won Mike back completely, but it was a small price to pay for Jake's downfall. With no job, no friends, and mounting debts, Jake was forced to move back into our parents' house. For someone who had always prided himself on his independence, it was a humiliating blow. But what made it even worse was the shift in our parents' attitude. For the first time, they began to see Jake for who he really was. "Jake," my mom said one evening during dinner, "we need to talk about your debts." Jake groaned, pushing his plate away. "Not this again." "Yes, this again," my dad interjected, his tone sharper than usual. "You've been living beyond your means for years, and now it's caught up with you. What were you thinking?" "I was managing just fine until everyone decided to turn on me," Jake snapped. He shot me a glare, and I could feel the accusation in his eyes. "This is all because of Grace." My mom looked between us, her expression conflicted. "Jake, you can't blame Grace for your mistakes. These problems didn't start overnight. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For once, my parents weren't rushing to defend him. They were finally holding him accountable." Jake's financial situation only got worse. His credit card companies began calling nonstop, demanding payment he couldn't afford. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the couch, staring at a stack of bills with his head in his hands. It was a far cry from the confident, larger-than-life brother I'd grown up with. "You need to get a job," I said bluntly. He looked up at me, his eyes red and tired. "You think I don't know that? No one will hire me." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you burned all your bridges," I shot back. Jake didn't respond. He just stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the bills untouched. Around this time, I began to see a shift in my parents' behavior. They were still supportive of Jake, but their patience was wearing thin. My dad, who had always been proud of Jake's accomplishments, started questioning his choices more openly. "You had everything handed to you," he said during one particularly heated argument. "We gave you every opportunity to succeed, and you threw it all away. Maybe if you'd supported me instead of always comparing me to Grace, things would have been different." Jake yelled back. The comment caught me off guard. Jake had always seemed so confident, so self-assured. Hearing him admit to feeling overshadowed by me was surprising, to say the least. But I didn't let it soften my resolve. He wasn't the victim here, I was. One of the most shocking moments came when a woman named Lila showed up at our house. She was Jake's ex, the one he'd cheated on, and she looked furious. "I need to talk to Jake," she said, standing on our front porch with her arms crossed. "He's not here," I lied, not wanting to deal with the drama. But Lila wasn't having it. "Fine," she said, pushing past me. "Then I'll wait." Jake came home about an hour later, and the moment he saw Lila, his face paled. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," she said, her voice icy. "I found out you used my credit card without my permission. You owe me $1,200, Jake." Jake tried to deny it, but Lila wasn't buying his excuses. She threatened to take him to court if he didn't pay her back. The confrontation was loud and messy, and my parents heard every word. By the time Lila stormed out, my mom looked like she was on the verge of tears. "Jake," she said quietly, "how could you do something like that?" Jake didn't have an answer. As the weeks went on, Jake became a shell of his former self. He spent most of his days sulking around the house, avoiding eye contact with anyone. My parents started setting boundaries, refusing to bail him out financially or clean up his messes. It was a long overdue wake-up call, but it didn't make things any easier for him. For me, watching Jake's downfall was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt vindicated. After years of being overshadowed and overlooked, I was finally getting the recognition I deserved. But on the other hand, it was hard not to feel a twinge of pity for him. As much as I resented Jake, he was still my brother. One night, I found him sitting alone in the backyard, staring up at the stars. He looked so defeated, so lost, that I almost felt sorry for him. "Jake," I said softly, sitting down next to him, "what are you going to do now?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." For the first time in years, Jake didn't seem like the confident, untouchable golden boy. He was just a scared, broken man trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces of his life. And while I didn't forgive him for everything he'd done, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a new chapter for both of us. For most of my life, I had been the forgotten sibling, the one overshadowed by Jake's endless charisma and charm. But now, for the first time, I was thriving, and it felt incredible. Everything Jake had taken from me, attention, respect, opportunities, I was finally reclaiming. And I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was flourishing. It all started with a promotion I'd been eyeing at work for months. I work as a project manager for a tech startup, and while I've always been good at my job, I never really pushed myself to go beyond my comfort zone. That changed after everything with Jake and Mike. I realized I'd spent too much time playing it safe, letting others take the spotlight while I stayed in the background. Not anymore. When the company announced they were creating a senior management position, I decided to go for it. The role came with a six-figure salary, $120,000 a year, and the chance to lead a high-profile team on a groundbreaking project. It was a long shot, but I poured everything into my application. I updated my resume, worked overtime on my current projects, and even scheduled a few strategy meetings with mentors to get their advice. During the interview process, I faced stiff competition. One of the other candidates, Maya, was a seasoned manager from another department with years of experience. I'd always admired her, but I couldn't let myself get intimidated. When it came time for the final interview with the CEO, I walked in with confidence I didn't even know I had. The day I got the call, I was at my desk, nervously refreshing my inbox. When the phone rang, my heart nearly stopped. "Grace." It was my boss, Sarah. "I just wanted to let you know. We're thrilled to offer you the position." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I finally managed to say, "Thank you. Thank you so much." That night, I celebrated with my coworkers, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally being seen for who I was. I wasn't Jake's sister or the quiet one in the background. I was Grace, the accomplished, independent woman who had earned her success. With my new salary, I decided to splurge on something I'd always dreamed of, a trip to Europe. I'd been saving for years, but with the promotion, I finally had the means to make it happen. I spent hours researching destinations, building an itinerary that included Paris, Rome, Barcelona, and Prague. It would cost around $10,000, but I didn't care. After everything I'd been through, I deserved this. As I started planning, I told my parents about the trip during dinner one night. "I've already booked my flights," I said, unable to hide my excitement. "I'm leaving in 3 months." My dad raised his eyebrows. "That sounds expensive." "It is," I said with a grin. "But I can afford it now." My mom smiled, though there was a hint of guilt in her eyes. "We're proud of you, Grace." "Really?" In the weeks that followed, my parents began to change. For as long as I could remember, they had always favored Jake. But now their faith in him was shaken. He was still living at home, struggling to find a job and pay off his debts while I was thriving. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One evening, my mom came into my room and sat down on the edge of my bed. "Grace," she said quietly, "I need to apologize." I looked up from my laptop, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her voice trembling. "For the way we treated you, for not giving you the attention and support you deserved. We were so caught up in Jake's charm that we didn't see how much it was hurting you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was happening, I didn't know what to say. "It's okay," I said finally. "I mean, it's not okay, but I appreciate you saying that." My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. "We're proud of you, Grace, and we're sorry it took us so long to show it." While my relationship with my parents improved, things with Jake remained tense. He avoided me as much as possible, and when we did cross paths, he could barely look me in the eye. I knew he blamed me for his downfall, even though he had no proof. But I didn't feel guilty. Jake had spent his entire life stepping on others to get ahead. It was about time he faced the consequences. One night, as I was packing for my trip, Jake knocked on my door. I opened it to find him standing there, looking disheveled and defeated. "Can we talk?" he asked. I hesitated, but stepped aside to let him in. He sat down on the edge of my bed, fidgeting with his hands. "I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. "I've lost everything. My job, my friends, even mom and dad don't trust me like they used to." I folded my arms, unsure how to respond. "Maybe you should start by taking responsibility for your actions." Jake sighed. "I know I messed up, okay? But it feels like everyone's turned against me." "Maybe because you've spent your whole life putting yourself first," I said. "You can't expect people to stick around when you treat them like tools." He looked down at his hands, his face etched with regret. "I guess I deserve that." It wasn't the heartfelt apology I'd hoped for, but it was a start. As much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. Jake had always been the golden boy, but now that his shine had faded, he was just a scared, broken man trying to pick up the pieces. As I boarded my flight to Europe a few weeks later, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. For years, I'd lived in Jake's shadow, constantly trying to prove my worth. But now, I was finally living life on my own terms. My career was thriving, my relationships were improving, and for the first time, I felt truly free. Jake's downfall had been painful to watch, but it had also been a wake-up call for everyone, including me. It showed me that I didn't need anyone else's validation to succeed. I was enough, just as I was. And as the plane took off, carrying me toward new adventures and possibilities, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. This was my time to shine, and I wasn't going to let anyone dim my light ever again.